So in a course on the ethics of eating, we're obviously talking about ethics, which is this philosophical discipline. We generate ethical theories oftentimes using conceptual analysis. We'll talk about how some of that works, and sit back in our armchairs and think about kind of big ethical paradigms that we can debate about and also try to apply in certain contexts. But in an ethics of eating context or course, clearly the focus is on the kind of application moment. And so we're looking at how, in our case, 4 different ethical frameworks might apply to various issues related to eating. So that means that we have to get our hands a little bit more into the details than some philosophers are equipped to do or want to do. We need to find out some empirical information about how we eat and how the food that we eat is produced and developed and disposed of. So, we're philosophers. We're not capable of doing this. We are by no means food scientists or scientists of any sort. And so we've utilized Cornell and Ithaca, which has a lot of resources in food science, animal science, nutrition science, various people who are out there farming, dealing with the empirical stuff of the earth and food, to try to supplement what we can provide as philosophers in the course. So one of the things I want to focus on here is empirical issues as it relates to the question of non-human animals, eating non-human animals. So what are some of the empirical issues we need to find out about? Well, one thing obviously is whether or not animals can suffer. So I mentioned before that I think suffering and animal welfare is one of the important ethical, morally relevant questions or features of the discussion here. And maybe the question can be answered empirically. We can look at their brains and see whether they have the right kinds of phenomena that would suggest that they feel raw pains. We can look at their behaviors and see if they're analogous to our behaviors when we're feeling more sophisticated kinds of pains. We can, at least by analogy, look at some of their group interactions and think about whether they are experiencing kind of loneliness or exclusion or solidarity or community or loss of community and so forth. We have to be really careful here because we can't get into the heads of animals in some, well, we can look at their brains, but in some figurative sense, we can't see the world from their point of view. But we can, I think, through scientific and other empirical observational techniques, get a sense of how they're doing and how our eating practices affect them. So that's one thing, the animals and the empirical issues involving animals. Another thing is health-related concerns. So obviously our health is an empirical matter. Are you healthy or are you not? And how does what you're eating affect your health? So we need to talk to nutritionists about what kinds of food and what kinds of preparations of food are best for our health and best for the health of people around us. That'll then relate to ethical issues regarding what kinds of food the industry is promoting, what kinds of food should they be promoting, should there be kind of political, ethical political action to make sure that people are educated and have access to the right kinds of food that the nutritionists empirically tell us is good for us. So there's another whole set of empirical issues that we need to consider when we think about eating, and especially eating animals. Third set of empirical issues relates to the environment. Obviously, whether or not the environment's doing well is an empirical question. How it does better and worse is also something we need to discover empirically. You can't just sit in the armchair and try to dream up ways in which we can get rid of greenhouse gases. So philosophers need to look to empirical people, scientists, and so forth, to tell us what kinds of things are relevant, and that'll help us then think, especially as it relates to the eating of animals, what sorts of practices we might want to avoid or encourage or otherwise consider. Okay, so those are some 3 ways in which empirical issues might figure into our discussion of the ethics of eating animals. One thing we need to watch out for is that people will kind of move between the actual situation and an ideal situation. So we'll talk to food scientists who's much more focused on what it could be like if we could do the right kinds of precision work and feed the animals exactly the right number of antibiotics and so forth. That it could be good for the animals, good for our health, good for the environment empirically. That might be right, but then we have to acknowledge that this is a kind of idealization. It's not the sort of armchair thing that a philosopher might do, but it is still a little pie in the sky. There's the actual world where a lot of different stakeholders are pushing in different directions, looking for efficiencies and economic advantage, and that often does not lead to the best situation for animals' health and the environment. So watch out for idealization versus the actual. It's important, though, to look at the ideal because we don't want to rule out possibilities for treating animals and eating animals that are out there and that technology could, and further kind of governmental policy and so forth, could bring into existence. So don't ignore the ideal empirical situation either.